The suffocating scent of thousands of white roses clung to the humid air, thick and cloying. Fiona's emerald silk dress clung to the sweat on her skin, her heart hammering a frantic, hollow rhythm against her ribs as she sat in the shadowed back row. Up ahead, beneath a canopy of dripping crystals and the glowing city skyline, the man she'd spent 5 years building a life with was kissing her younger sister. The applause from the high society guests was deafening. Her mother was weeping in the front row, tears of joy she had never once shed for Fiona. What Fiona didn't know, as a single hot tear traced a slow path down her cheek, was that the most lethal shadow in the city's underworld was standing just yards away. Johan wasn't looking at the bride. His dark, calculating gaze was locked entirely on Fiona, watching her with the kind of absolute, quiet focus that alters destinies. He wasn't there to celebrate a union. He was there to settle a blood debt. And before this night is over, Fiona is going to learn a brutal, necessary truth: the difference between a man who builds a cage out of your sacrifices and a man who hands you the matches to burn it all down. But to understand why a ruthless Korean syndicate boss would infiltrate a lavish wedding for a brilliant architect he met exactly once, we have to go back to a dark alleyway, a makeshift tourniquet, and a choice that forged an unbreakable bond. If you're ready to watch a woman stop playing the victim and start playing to win, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is for anyone who has ever poured their soul into someone else's foundation only to be left in the rubble. For years, Fiona worked double shifts, unknowingly funding Marcus's corporate rise while he forged her signature to buy Bella's ring. But we aren't starting with the deception. We're starting at the breaking point. The officiant's final words echoed over the microphone. Fiona forced her hands to clap. The sound felt like shattered glass against her palms. She wasn't just watching a wedding. She was bearing witness to the public demolition of her own life. The velvet of the back row chair felt like crushed glass against Fiona's spine. Around her, the string quartet's melody swelled, a hauntingly beautiful arrangement of a song that used to be theirs, now distorted into a weapon, twisting slowly in her gut. She dug her fingernails into her satin clutch, the sharp pain the only thing anchoring her to the present, keeping her from screaming until her throat bled. At the altar, bathed in the warm, golden glow of 100 floating candles, Marcus took Bella's hands. His voice, smooth and polished, a corporate charm honed in the boardrooms Fiona had bankrolled, echoed through the crystal-clear audio system she had unknowingly financed. "When I look at you," Marcus murmured, his gaze locked lovingly on Bella's beaming face, "I don't just see my future. I see the very architecture of a soul I want to dwell in forever." Bile rose hot and sharp in Fiona's throat. The architecture of a soul. The breath was knocked from her lungs. It was the exact phrase he had scribbled on a grease-stained cocktail napkin 3 years ago. They had been sitting in their cramped, drafty apartment, splitting a cheap bottle of wine while she drafted blueprints under a flickering bulb to pay his MBA tuition. He hadn't just stolen her savings, her inheritance, and her sister. He was recycling her memories. He was wearing the love she built for him like a stolen suit. "You are the foundation I never knew I needed," Marcus continued, his voice cracking with perfectly timed emotion, "the light that guided me out of the dark." Every stolen word was a physical blow. The high society guests swooned in unison. In the front row, their mother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, radiating a fierce maternal pride she had never once directed at her eldest daughter. Not a single head turned, not a single eye drifted to the back of the room. Fiona was entirely invisible, a ghost haunting the graveyard of her own sacrifices. She closed her eyes, the sweat on her skin turning cold as the betrayal settled deep into her marrow. She had spent a lifetime making herself small so her sister could shine, making herself a stepping stone so Marcus could climb.
and this was her reward. But as the crowd stood to applaud the final blessing, the suffocating heat of the room suddenly fractured. A sharp, metallic chill cut through the heavy perfume of the white roses. The atmospheric pressure dropped, the air growing instantly thin. Someone had just entered the back of the hall. A shadow detached itself from the gilded archway near the exit, moving with a silent, predatory grace that had absolutely nothing to do with the radiant couple at the altar.
The reception hall was a labyrinth of champagne towers and forced laughter, a glittering cage where Fiona felt more like a ghost than a guest. She retreated to a dim corner, her emerald dress blending into the heavy velvet curtains, desperate to avoid her mother's triumphant gaze. But the air around her suddenly changed, turning sharp and cold, as if the city's winter had breached the climate-controlled ballroom. He was there. Standing near the marble columns was a man who didn't belong in this world of polished lies. Yawan wore a suit that cost more than Marcus's entire wedding, yet he carried it with the lethal indifference of a soldier. His presence was a jagged blade slicing through the soft fabric of the party. As his dark, obsidian eyes scanned the room and locked onto hers, the noise of the clinking glasses faded into a dull hum, and Fiona was pulled back to a rainy Tuesday night a year ago. The smell of wet asphalt and iron had been overwhelming then. She had taken a shortcut through the industrial district, her mind heavy with blueprints, when she saw him. He was slumped against a dumpster in a narrow alley, his white shirt crimson and tattered. He looked less like a man and more like a fallen god being reclaimed by the earth. Fiona hadn't screamed, she hadn't run. Instead, the instinct that made her a master architect, the need to stabilize a collapsing structure, took over. She had knelt in the grime, her heart drumming against her ribs. With trembling hands, she reached into her drafting bag and pulled out her heavy-duty steel ruler and a roll of industrial measuring tape. "Don't move," she had whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. She used the ruler as a brace and the measuring tape as a makeshift tourniquet, cranking it tight above the jagged wound in his thigh until the arterial spray slowed to a rhythmic seep. He had watched her the whole time, his face a mask of agonizing calm, his hand hovering near a hidden holster before falling limp. He didn't thank her, he only memorized her face with a terrifying intensity. Now, in the middle of her own ruin, that same intensity was directed at her from across the ballroom. Yeon didn't look at the champagne or the dancing bride. He looked at Fiona as if she were the only solid thing in a room full of smoke. He began to move, his stride predatory and purposeful, cutting a path through the elite crowd that parted instinctively before him. The man who lived in the shadows had stepped into her light, and Fiona realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the blood debt she had forgotten was about to be paid in full. Marcus saw the shift in the room's gravity. Ever the opportunist, he broke away from a group of laughing investors, smoothing his tuxedo jacket as he moved toward the man in the dark suit. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice practiced and inviting, "I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Marcus, the—" Yeon didn't stop. He didn't even turn his head. He brushed past Marcus with a chilling indifference that left the groom standing mid-sentence, a forgotten prop in his own celebration. The silence that followed Yeon's wake was heavy, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Fiona's breath hitched as the shadow finally stopped in front of her. Up close, Yeon was a mountain of cold, tailored violence. The scent of rain and expensive tobacco replaced the cloying perfume of the roses. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the path of the dried tear on her cheek with a clinical intensity. "You're trembling," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in the small space between them. It wasn't a question or an observation of weakness, it was an assessment of a structural flaw. "I'm fine," Fiona whispered, though her hands clutching the silk of her skirt betrayed her. "No,
You are standing in the center of a masterpiece you built, watching someone else set it on fire, Yeon replied. He stepped closer, his presence an impenetrable shield that blocked out the rest of the ballroom. I told you that night in the rain that I would pay my debt. I don't pay in gratitude, Fiona. I pay in leverage. He reached out, his gloved fingers barely brushing the air near her chin, forcing her to look up. I could take you out of here right now. We could walk out those doors and you would never have to see these people again. Fiona looked past him, seeing Marcus and Bella laughing as they cut into a 7-tier cake paid for with her stolen inheritance. The rage, long buried under years of being the strong one, flickered to life. But leaving is just a quiet way to lose, Yeon continued, his gaze narrowing. I think you'd prefer to stay. I think you'd prefer to watch the foundation of his life crumble while you hold the blueprints. Tell me, Fiona, do you want to run or do you want to win? The choice hung between them, a jagged piece of glass. For the first time in years, Fiona didn't look for an exit. She looked at the man who saw the warrior beneath the architect, and she felt the first crack in the mask of the victim.
Winning, Fiona whispered, the word tasting like copper and adrenaline. As she looked into Yeun's unwavering eyes, the glittering ballroom began to blur, replaced by the flickering fluorescent hum of a life she had lived in the margins. She remembered the 3 a.m. shifts at the drafting table, her fingers cramped around a mechanical pencil until they bled. To the world, she was a rising architect, but to Marcus, she was a silent engine. She had taken on the grueling freelance contracts, the ones the senior partners wouldn't touch, just to ensure his MBA tuition was paid in full, on time, and without a single loan in his name. She had lived on black coffee and the promise of a together that was always just one promotion away. One specific memory surged forward, sharper than the rest. It was a rainy Tuesday 6 months ago. Marcus had surprised her at the office, taking her to a candlelit dinner at a bistro overlooking the North Ridge estates. She had been so exhausted her eyes were bloodshot, her hands shaking from 48 hours of straight labor. "Look at that house, Fiona," he had murmured, pointing to a sprawling glass and stone manor on the hillside. The clean lines, the open floor plan, it's perfect for a family. It's perfect for us. She smiled, tears of relief pricking her eyes, thinking her sacrifices had finally been seen. She spent that entire dinner mentally redesigning the load-bearing walls, imagining where their children would play, thinking they were scouting their future. But as she stood in the wedding hall now, watching Bella whisper something to Marcus that made him bark with laughter, the truth rearranged itself like a sickening puzzle. He hadn't been taking her there to dream. He had been taking her there to consult. He had used her professional eye to vet the property he was already planning to buy with the inheritance he was systematically draining from her accounts. He had used her heart to build the home and her brain to secure the foundation, all so he could hand the keys to her sister. She wasn't just a guest at this wedding, she was the primary investor in her own replacement. "He didn't just take my money," Fiona said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low octave. The architectural tools she had used to save Yeun's life were the same ones she had used to build Marcus's world. "He took the years I can't get back. He turned my talent into his dowry." Yeun tilted his head, a shadow of a smile playing on his lips, a predator recognizing a kindred spirit. "Then don't just take it back, Fiona. Make sure that when it falls, not one stone is left standing on another." The clinking of a crystal glass against a silver spoon rang through the ballroom like a funeral knell. Fiona stood at the mahogany podium, the weight of the microphone in her hand feeling like a leaden pipe. The spotlight was a blinding, clinical white, exposing every tremor she fought to suppress. Below her, Bella beamed, her veil tossed back to reveal a face of unblemished innocence, while Marcus sat beside her, wearing the smug, satisfied expression of a man who had successfully pulled off the heist of a century. "A toast," Fiona began, her voice brittle, echoing through the silent hall. "To my sister Bella, who always knew how to take what she wanted, and to Marcus, a man who knows exactly how to use what is given to him." The guests chuckled softly, misinterpreting the edge in her voice as bridal party wit. But as she drew a breath to continue the hollow script her mother had practically forced down her throat, her clutch, perched on the edge of the lectern, vibrated. Then again, a relentless, rhythmic buzzing. Fiona glanced down. The screen was illuminated with a series of notifications from an encrypted number. Files received. With a practiced, numb grace, she swiped the screen under the guise of checking her notes. Her heart didn't just drop, it disintegrated. The first document was a high-interest business loan for $5 million, dated 3 months ago. At the bottom, in bold, sweeping ink, was her own signature. But she had never seen this paper. She hadn't signed for a loan in years. She scrolled. The second was a wire transfer from her personal inheritance trust directly into an offshore account owned by a shell company, M&B Developments. Marcus and Bella. The air in the room seemed to crystallize, turning into sharp shards of ice that pierced her lungs. It wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a systematic execution of her future. He hadn't just left her, he had turned her into the silent guarantor of his new life, shackling her to debts that would take 3 lifetimes to pay off, while he toasted to their future. Fiona looked up from the glowing screen. Across the room, leaning against a marble pillar, Yaun caught her eye. He didn't nod, he didn't smile. He simply raised his glass in a silent, lethal salute. The invisible guest had delivered the killing blow, and now he was waiting to see if she would swing the blade. "To the happy couple," Fiona said. Her voice suddenly dropped an octave, losing its tremor and gaining a terrifying rhythmic clarity. She looked directly at Marcus, seeing the flicker of confusion in his eyes as her tone shifted. "May you get exactly what you've earned. Tonight is a celebration of a union, but more importantly, it's the end of an era." She downed her champagne in one jagged gulp. The glass didn't break in her hand, but as she stepped off the stage, she could hear the imaginary sound of her old life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The architect was finished building for others. It was time to start the demolition. Fiona descended the stairs, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. She didn't head back to the family table. She moved toward the periphery, where the shadows were deeper and the air was cooler. Marcus was already in damage control mode, flashing his $1 million smile at a group of venture capitalists, trying to smooth over the cryptic edge of Fiona's toast with practiced, hollow charm. Then, the sea of silk and wool parted. Yaun didn't just walk, he reclaimed space. He moved toward Marcus with the terrifying grace of a predator who had found a stray lamb in a den of wolves. "Ah, there you are." Yaun's voice cut through the ambient chatter, low and resonant. The group around Marcus went silent, sensing a shift in the room's hierarchy that they couldn't quite name. Marcus straightened his tie, his chest puffing out slightly as he tried to match the newcomer's stature. "Sir, we haven't been formally introduced. Marcus Thorne. I'm the CEO of—" "Thorne?" Yaun interrupted, his brow furrowing in a mask of puzzled condescension. He looked Marcus up and down, his gaze lingering on the expensive watch, the one Fiona had bought him for his 30th birthday, as if it were a cheap trinket. "My apologies. I must have mistaken you for one of my associates' collections. You look remarkably like a man named Markey who handles the short-term, high-interest accounts down at the shipping yards, the ones who are always 3 weeks behind on their vig." A collective sharp intake of breath rippled through the circle of elites. The term collection hum in the air like a foul odor. In this room, being a criminal was almost acceptable if you were at the top, but being low-level was a social death sentence. Marcus's face drained of color, his golden tan turning a sickly grayish hue under the crystal chandeliers. I think there's been a gross misunderstanding. I'm an Ivy League graduate. I've just secured a $5 million expansion." "Ah, yes, the expansion," Yaun said, stepping closer until he was towering over the groom, his shadow swallowing Marcus whole.
He reached out and flicked a speck of dust off Marcus's lapel, a gesture of profound disrespect that made the investors flinch. I heard about that. Funny, the underwriters mentioned the collateral was a bit unstable, almost as if the signatures were still wet. The whispers began, a low, hissing sound that filled the ballroom. The investors who had been leaning toward Marcus moments ago now stepped back, creating a physical gap between him and the capital he so desperately needed. Marcus looked around, his eyes wide and frantic, searching for an escape. He found Fiona instead. She didn't look away. She stood near the man who had just dismantled Marcus's ego with a single sentence, her heart no longer racing with fear, but with a cold architectural precision. The cracks weren't just forming, the foundation was screaming, and for the first time, Fiona wasn't afraid of the collapse.
The cool night air was a shock against Fiona's skin, cutting through the suffocating heat of the ballroom and the sickly sweet scent of white roses. She stumbled into the dimly lit parking lot, her lungs burning as if she'd been running for miles. The distant, muffled beat of the wedding band felt like a fading heart, one she was finally ready to let stop. A heavy door clicked shut behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. The scent of ozone and expensive tobacco preceded him, a stark contrast to the artificial luxury of the reception. Yeon stepped into the pool of light from a flickering street lamp, his silhouette long and jagged against the asphalt. "The gala is still in full swing," he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet night. "Why leave before the final act?" "I've seen enough," Fiona replied, her voice trembling despite her efforts. "I've seen the man I loved turn into a stranger. I've seen my sister wear my life like a costume." Yeon walked toward a sleek, black sedan, the metal gleaming like a whetted blade. He pulled a tablet from the interior and handed it to her. The screen was already glowing, a digital paper trail laid out with the cold precision of a blueprint. "You're an architect, Fiona. You know that a building doesn't collapse from a single gust of wind. It falls because the internal supports were designed to fail." Fiona took the device, her eyes scanning the lines of text. She expected to see more of Marcus's forgeries, more stolen wire transfers, more fake business loans. But as she scrolled, her heart slowed to a terrifying heavy beat. There, tucked into an email thread between Marcus and a private wealth manager, was an attachment titled Trust Relinquishment Authorization. At the bottom of the document, next to the forged squiggle that was supposed to be Fiona's name, was a second signature. It was elegant, looped, and unmistakably real. "Mother?" Fiona whispered, the word barely a breath. The document showed that her mother hadn't just stood by. She had provided the master keys. She had authorized the transfer of Fiona's inheritance into Marcus's accounts months before the wedding, citing Fiona's financial instability as the reason for the emergency shift. Her mother had known about the debt. She had known about Bella. She had helped Marcus strip the foundation of Fiona's life bare so that Bella could have a house built on the ruins. "The loan documents Marcus used to bury you, your mother was the witness to the notary," Yeon said, stepping into her personal space. His presence was the only thing keeping her upright as the world tilted. She looked back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom, where the silhouette of her mother was visible, laughing with a glass of champagne in hand. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just a partner who had failed her, it was the very person who had brought her into the world. "Every load-bearing wall in your life was a lie," Yeun murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a dark, predatory sympathy. "The demolition is complete, Fiona. Now, tell me, what do you want to build in its place?" The tablet screen flickered in the darkness, the blue light casting sharp, skeletal shadows across Fiona's face. The muffled bass of the wedding playlist thudded in the distance, a rhythmic reminder of the celebration happening just beyond the tree line, fueled by her blood and her mother's betrayal. Yoon stepped closer, his presence a heavy, cold weight that seemed to pull the very heat from the air.
He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly steady for a man whose hands dealt in chaos. "I have men who specialize in silence, Fiona," he said, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper that made the hair on her arms stand up. By sunrise, Marcus could be a memory. No body, no scandal, no more breath wasted on a man who treated your heart like a line of credit. I can make him disappear so completely it will be as if he never existed. Fiona looked at the glowing windows of the ballroom. She could see Marcus's silhouette through the glass, his head thrown back in a laugh, a glass of her champagne raised to a future built on her ruin. The image should have broken her. Instead, it acted like a catalyst, turning the grief in her marrow into something hard and indestructible. "No," she said, the word cutting through the night like a blade. Yoon tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You still feel for him? Even after seeing your mother's signature on the warrant for your execution?" "It's not feeling," Fiona replied, turning to face him. Her voice was devoid of the tremors that had plagued her all day. It was the voice of a woman calculating the load-bearing stress of a skyscraper. "Disappearing is too merciful. Death is a quick exit. I want him to stay. I want him to watch." She looked back at the tablet, her mind already rearranging the data points into a sequence of demolition. "He built this life on a foundation of stolen glass," she continued, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. "I don't want him gone. I want him stripped. I want to take back every cent, every asset, and every shred of his reputation until he is standing in the middle of a crowded room and no one even remembers his name. I want to see the moment he realizes that without my money and my mind, he is nothing but a hollow shell." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Yoon's face, not the smile of a savior, but of a partner who had finally found an equal. He took the tablet from her hand, his fingers lingering against hers. "Public, legal, and financial annihilation," he murmured, tasting the words. "A much slower burn. It requires patience, Fiona, and a total lack of mercy. I used to build homes for people who didn't deserve them. Now I'm going to enjoy tearing one down."
The air in the new office didn't smell like roses. It smelled of fresh cedar, expensive vellum, and the sharp, clean scent of rain through an open window. Fiona stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of her own firm, the city lights below mapping out a grid of endless possibilities. The name etched into the glass door behind her wasn't a family name or a husband's name. It was hers. Across the city, in a space of cold concrete and flickering fluorescent hum, Marcus sat on a thin cot. The financial empire he'd tried to steal had collapsed with the surgical precision of a controlled demolition. The forged signatures, the offshore accounts, and the systematic theft of Fiona's inheritance had been laid bare in a courtroom that felt more like an operating theater. Even their mother hadn't been spared. The legal fallout of her complicity had stripped her of the social standing she'd prioritized over her own blood. Marcus was no longer a CEO, a groom, or a visionary. He was a number in a ledger, finally paying a debt he could never hope to settle. Fiona traced the edge of a new blueprint on her desk. The lines were bold, the structure uncompromising. She was no longer building cages for others to inhabit. She was designing a life that couldn't be shaken. A soft, heavy click echoed in the quiet room. She didn't need to turn to know the shadow had arrived. Yoon leaned against the doorframe, his dark overcoat still damp from the evening mist. He didn't approach the desk, nor did he issue a command. He simply stood there, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the room's expansive light. "The permits for the Northridge project were approved this afternoon," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "The investors are calling it the most ambitious design the city has seen in a decade.
It's a solid foundation, Fiona replied, finally turning to face him. A month ago, she had been a ghost at her own erasure. Now she stood with her shoulders squared, the emerald dress of the wedding replaced by a suit that felt like armor. She looked at Youn not as a savior she owed her life to, but as a man who had recognized the steel in her before she had found it herself. He didn't move to claim her, and he didn't treat her like an asset to be managed. He watched her with a quiet, lethal respect. They were no longer a debt and a debtor. They were two architects of a different kind of power. "What's next, Fiona?" he asked, his dark eyes reflecting the glowing city behind her. Fiona looked out at the skyline, her mind already drafting the future. "I'm done fixing what was broken," she said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. "From now on, I only build from the ground up."
If you're ready to watch more stories of high-stakes revenge and the kind of love that's forged in shadows, don't let the fire go out here. Fiona's journey of demolition and design is just the beginning. If you enjoyed seeing the architect take back her power, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new chapter. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Are you on Team Fiona or are you waiting to see what Yeon does next? Until the next blueprint is drawn, stay sharp, stay strong, and remember, never let someone else build their future on your foundation. I'll see you in the next one.